This is Horror Podcast.
Welcome to This is Horror, a podcast for readers, writers, and creators. I'm Michael David Wilson, and every episode alongside my co-host Bob Pastorella, we chat with masters of horror about writing, life lessons, creativity, and much more. Now today's guest is Gemma Amor. She is a British author of horror fiction, a podcaster, and an illustrator. And she has written a number of books, including her latest from Angry Robot, Full Immersion. She also co-wrote the fantastic podcast Calling Darkness and has contributed to a number of other podcasts, including the No Sleep podcast. Now, this is the second of a two-part conversation, but as with all of these, you can listen in any order. And in this one, we talk a little bit more about her novel Full Immersion and working with Angry Robot. We also talk about artificial intelligence and some Dear Laura adaptations, both current and potentially forthcoming ones. But before any of that, a little bit of an advert break.
Tried and True are done to death. It Was All a Dream, an anthology of bad horror tropes done right, revives even the most exhausted cliches with stories from some of horror's biggest names like Gemma Files, Gabino Iglesias, and Haley Piper. It Was All a Dream, an anthology of bad horror tropes done right, available October 18th anywhere you buy books online. Pre-order now. Use this code ThisIsHorror for 20% off through the month of October when you order direct from HungryShadowPress.com.
Horror on Main, a new weekend convention for the horror community.
This is Bram Stoker and Elgin Award-nominated author Jessica McHugh, and I'm hoping you'll join me May 26th through the 28th in Hunt Valley, Maryland, where I'll be a guest of honor and the featured poet at Horror on Main. This convention is like a love letter to the horror community, with writers, artists, actors, directors, pretty much anything you could want if you love the horror genre as much as I do. So come on down to Hunt Valley Memorial Day weekend, and I'll see you at Horror on Main.
See horroronmain.com for details.
All right, with that said, here it is. It is part 2 of Gemma Amor on This is Horror. Going back to Full Immersion, I'm wondering how closely the Full Immersion we have today resembles what you submitted to Angry Robot, because we know that it's quite different to what you initially wrote, in the sense that it was more just a diary and you didn't initially conceive of this being published. But how about the changes from submission to what is imminently out there in the world?
Sure. It went through various different processes. Actually, I think at the same time that I submitted it to Angry Robot, I knew there was something not quite right with it in terms of the balance of characters and the way some of the characters were presented. So for kind of clarity, the book has quite a small cast of characters. It has Magpie, who's the kind of main protagonist and narrator. It has her mysterious friend who goes unnamed, and then it has 2 other unnamed characters who are respectively, well, actually Evans has a name, and then Evans is boss. So that's kind of the main 4. And when I originally sent the manuscript, Angry Robot had a lot of very good feedback as to, I have a default mode sometimes of writing people who are very unsympathetic. I think perhaps that's some of my own experience in how I've been treated by medical professionals or, whatever in the past coming through. When you have a cast of characters that are all unsympathetic or quite difficult to access or quite kind of cold on the surface, or unlikable, I suppose is the word. It can be harder for a reader sometimes to access their own emotions and why they should care perhaps about some of those people. I'm not saying or advocating that everybody has to write likable characters, because I think that's bullshit. But I think sometimes when there's an opportunity to create people in a more nuanced way, good and bad, then what Angry Robot did was they pointed that out to me. And simultaneously to that, and I've kind of mentioned him in the acknowledgements at the back of the book as well, so I'm sure he won't mind me thanking him, I sent a rough edit version of this over to Glenn Mazzara, who's a kind of noted screenwriter. He was EP for The Walking Dead, I think, at one point. Really good guy, really, really strong grasp of, I guess, story arc. And he very, very quickly pointed out several main flaws with the novel around the character balance and the dynamics. And so it was almost a kind of organic process of those two bits of feedback together. It made me switch. For example, Evans and Evans's boss were both men in the original draft. I then realised it would probably, I think mostly thanks to Glenn's feedback, be better to explore what it would be like to have a woman in a managerial role assessing another woman's mental health and managing that, particularly as it related to postnatal stuff. And if she, in her own right, was also a parent and a carer, what extra dynamic that would bring, rather than the initial dynamic, which was kind of two very cold, unsympathetic men overseeing the treatment of a woman, which I think has been done to death, quite honestly, anyway. It changed the book completely, having another female character in it. That's just one example. Other things included, just like general developmental edits where people kind of pointed out, well, perhaps you should play more on this scene and build up some more dread here. Perhaps we can put some more foreshadowing in here. We need to pull back on this scene because it perhaps isn't very necessary. Other things like that. It was a very, an extremely educational process for me, writing this book, because I still now feel like there's stuff that I could continue to tweak and change and make better, but I always feel like that about every book. It definitely isn't anything like it was when it was first submitted back in the end of 2020, I think it was, that I sent over the original manuscript. But I think that's how most books go, right? I think most books don't look anything like the original version of it that you send when they finally hit the shelves or hit your reader's hands.
Yeah. And of course, what you just said begs the question, how did you first get connected with Glenn Mazzara?
Social media, I think. I can't really remember. I just am. I can't remember. I genuinely can't remember. Like, I'm literally such a whore on social media. I would just follow and talk to anybody, in a kind of appropriate way, obviously. I'm very lucky. I'm able to sort of put a call out and say, would anybody like to help me beta read this version of the manuscript? And people will respond, and he responded. And so I sent it to him, which I'm very grateful for. And hopefully I'll get a chance to do the same for him in the future, if he ever sends anything my way. Most things for me are about like relationships that are kind of mutually founded, It's really easy. You can always tell when somebody wants to be friends with you because they want something out of you, versus they genuinely take an interest in you and your life and your career, and they want to help, and the kind of unspoken acknowledgement that you would do the same for them. And that's how I approach most relationships and stuff. So yeah, it's all, I keep saying it, I'm banging the same old drum, but it really is about social media a lot of the time.
Yeah. And I love too that you just put a call out, and of all your connections, it was Glenn Mazzara who decided, I'll take a look at it. It's like,
yeah, he's a very, very, he's a great advocate for other writers. He's extremely helpful and supportive. He knows his shit, obviously, inside and out. He's a really nice guy. He's very approachable as well. So he's worth a follow. He often shares like nuggets of wisdom and things online about his writing process and this, that, and the other. So he's a good guy, is Glenn.
I probably should follow him, especially because I was thinking, damn, how are you connected with him? And then I had a cheeky navigate to his page, and it's like, oh shit, he follows me. Why aren't I following him back? So, yeah.
Michael, go and have a strong word with yourself and sit on the naughty step for 5 minutes.
I know. I mean, probably what happened was he probably started following me at a point where someone had like tagged me in something absolutely meaningless, and I was just like crossing off notifications. And then,
I mean, I'm no expert, but he seems like an ideal candidate for This Is Horror interview. I mean, just saying.
There you go.
The words right out of my mouth.
Yeah, but Bob's like, he's following you and you haven't invited him onto This Is Horror.
I will accept a consultation fee.
A consultation fee. Fucking hell. Oh, let's move on before I'm in even more debt. Let's not give out. Respect my boundaries. No.
I'm sorry, Michael. I'm sorry, I've overstepped. I will take myself to the naughty step now.
Yeah.
I'll hang my head between my knees in shame.
Yeah, I mean, I presume that you used to boys shouting "respect my boundaries" at you after what you said about your son.
Yeah,
so
completely, absolutely. I'm just trying to comb your hair. Respect my boundaries. Oh, fine.
Yeah. You'll have difficulty combing my hair these days anyway.
Where there's a will, there's a way, Michael.
Yeah, there you go. But I mean, with the start of the book and obviously the initial premise, this idea of someone discovering their own dead body. I mean, this works obviously on multiple levels, metaphorically and literally. So, I mean, what was the genesis for this specific part of the story?
I mean, so it's interesting for me because that's obviously the hook that I use to sell the book, in the kind of, I guess, the key line, whatever you want to call it, the blurb. But it's actually a very small part of the novel. It is, as you read it, as you go through it, it's an introduction to the idea that the protagonist is not in a situation that is normal, obviously. It's a device in order to kind of try and unsettle the reader as quickly as possible because, again, it's such an outrageous concept, sort of staring at your own dead body. But it's a very small part of what actually unfolds. But the idea for it came, as most things do, it was most books for me start with like an image that just flashes into my mind, or a sound or a song or a snippet of dialogue that pops up. And this for me was it was the image of, it's based in Bristol where I live, and there's a river that goes underneath a huge suspension bridge, which I'm very well acquainted with for various different reasons. And there's a very noticeable kind of thick mud bank sort of lining this river. It's a big river, that sort of tidal river that goes out into the Severn Estuary. And it just, I used to look at that mud a lot and kind of always thought it was a good analogy for how it felt to be depressed, which I'll come back to later because that imagery then plays out throughout the entirety of the book. But also just the idea of a body lying on the mud bank, kind of face up staring at the sky, was just popped into my head. And I started to play with that in terms of what it would feel like if you looked down and realized you were looking at yourself. How would that feel? How weird would that be? Not in a way that you're like a ghost, but in an actual, I'm alive, but I'm looking at my own dead body. How would that play out? But it also coincided with several other images that I had that I dumped down that sort of all merged together to form the book. It's a difficult book to explain the writing process of because it's such a symbolic book in so many ways. So the other idea that I had was if you were assessing your own life and you could assess it via a series of objects to kind of define key moments in your life, which is a big part of the plot of the novel, how would that look if it was presented in a real world sense? So let's say somebody gave you 5 objects from your life that were significant to you, and you chose a vase, a coffee cup, a pair of glasses, crystal ball, do you know what I mean? A shoe. How would you then present those in a way that you could navigate through in order to create a narrative, right? And then I started to think about a gallery, and a gallery lined with pedestals, and upon those pedestals were a series of objects, and those objects were particularly significant to me. And it became like a bit of a therapy thought experiment because, like I said, when I started writing this, it was mostly I've got feelings that I need to explore and I've got issues that I need to deal with. What's the best way of me doing that? And it started as a kind of series of diary entries, and then I started to use this concept of I need to think about my life in relation to a series of objects that will help me deal with some difficult things. And then from there, it just kind of grew and grew and grew as I started to think about actually, how could you then make a novel which is about a dead body and about a gallery full of objects and make that accessible to a reader who knows fuck all about you and your brain and why it's working in that way. And then I started to think, well, in what ways in the modern world do we find ourselves suddenly immersed in kind of weird situations that don't make any sense, but visually are very arresting or very consuming? And I was like, video games, you know? Mm-hmm. And then I started to think beyond that, like, because, you know, when you're navigating like a puzzle game, which I play a lot of puzzle games, and you're walking around these beautiful kind of 3D environments, right? There's no threat involved. You're just exploring and searching and solving puzzles. And I love that kind of gameplay. And then I started to think about how could you ratchet that up a level? Maybe we could start thinking about virtual reality technology and being fully kind of immersed. And then that's how suddenly the actual nugget of the book came out finally. So it was a very long, convoluted process of like sorting through random snippets of imagery, random thought processes, random thought experiments, and trying to shove all that into like an actual cohesive novel that somebody else would be able to read and understand. And hopefully I've done that. I still think some readers struggle with a few of the bits to do with the ending. Some of the imagery they don't quite get because it's very personal, unique to me. But I don't think you necessarily have to understand all of it to access the main message of the book anyway. So yeah, that's it. I always struggle to kind of pin down the origins of a book because my process is so messy and chaotic, and it's like a scrapbook. My head is like a scrapbook of snippets of this and pictures and colours and feelings and thoughts and emotions and music and sights and sounds. And somehow I managed to get all those scraps down or thread all those beads onto a necklace in a way that makes sense eventually, but it takes me a while to get there. It's a journey. So
and when you have all those objects and those scraps and they're kind of dancing and competing in your head, do you, as well as writing it down, do you have like a kind of, I guess, physical space with different objects, or like a cork board, or just something so you've also got that realia as well as, you know, just the writing? I don't know if you use objects as an aid for the creative process.
I do very much. I'm very object driven. I have a I am very sentimental. I attach a lot of significance to objects. I have a lot of objects in memory boxes and in storage and around my house that have huge importance to me. So I've always been that way inclined. When I'm writing, I have aids on my desk that help me focus. Like I've got a crystal and a big lump of rose quartz and a kind of color changing sphere and stuff. I find I'm a very sensory person. I do need to scribble notes down on a whiteboard, but I'm not one of those kind of crazy whiteboard planners with the red thread and the pins and the flags and all that shit. I can't do that because it's too logical for my brain. But I do like to have an extra notebook that helps me when I'm out walking. An idea might suddenly smack me that, oh shit, I haven't done that, or I haven't tied off that thread, or I haven't said this thing. And then I'll jot that down. And then frequently I'll go through the manuscript and look back at the notebook and see, oh, these are some of the observations and thoughts I had. I wish I was more structured in my approach to writing a book. I desperately wish I had a more systematic way of doing it, but everything I do creatively is very organic, which is why it's so nice to have an editorial team to kind of help keep me on track this time. But no, I don't have a gallery in my house per se. Maybe I should. I've been toying with the idea. One day when I'm loaded and I've got a mansion.
I mean, you were saying you were privileged. I suppose we were trying to test how privileged are you? It's like a gallery.
Not in the sense, not in the
sense
sense that I can walk down a marble colonnaded gallery full of self-indulgent objects to do with my life. No, definitely not. There's a cardboard box in the attic.
We've all got to have a humble beginning. So you've got the cardboard box. We can work on the marble later.
Exactly. Yeah.
I suppose with the kind of virtual reality and the experimental treatments, I mean, it's easy to make Black Mirror comparisons. So was that something you were conscious of in both the writing?
Definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, it's hard not to be influenced by Black Mirror. I think, again, particularly as a British person, because so many of the episodes revolve around British society and politics and culture and stuff here. Not so much as the series kind of evolves in the later series, but definitely early on. And I mean, Charlie Brooker is a kind of British institution that's been on the TV scene over here for a long, long time, and has defined a lot of how we interact with each other comedically and what we consume in that sense as well. So I am fascinated by the potential of technology, always have been. I don't understand as much about it as I would like. I will admit to that, being extremely unable to process deeply technological concepts just because my brain isn't wired that way. But the human potential inherent in evolving tech and how it can change our lives and make them better or make them worse is something that Black Mirror has always explored, and something that I've always, sought in terms of reading material. I've always read, I was saying on another show that I've read a lot of Isaac Asimov when I was younger, and I'm just I was a big Trekkie when I was younger. Like, tech is, a lot of people are afraid of it, and it features heavily in the horror genre and in the sci-fi genre as something to be afraid of. But for me, I wanted to explore what it would be like to use it as a tool for self-discovery and for improvement and for healing and for discovering one's own potential and bringing things out. And the more I thought about virtual reality in particular, and the more I realized what's happening in people that are experimenting with it, not just physically, but mentally, the more I was like, just think about the applications of if this program was real in the real world. Like, and one of the characters in the novel kind of goes into that a little bit. She sort of says, think about child therapy, think about police work, think about advertising, think about all sorts of ways in which it could kind of enhance our lives, I guess. And that does fascinate me. And I think fiction often deals with that relationship that humans have with technology as being a bit of a kind of, we're a bit afraid of its potential, but also these are the ways in which it could enhance our lives. So another one that always inspired me in that sense was Altered Carbon, which the first two series of that were fantastic as well on, was it Netflix? I can't remember. But the idea of kind of reincarnating yourself over and over again, keeping the same identity but multiple different kind of physical forms over the years, and the upsides to that, and then the definite downsides to that too. And humans are obsessed with longevity as well, right? Like, we want to live forever. In some senses, you can kind of do that online and in a computer game or with code, right? There's an imprint of all of us that exists now on the internet that will probably be around for many, many years to come, even after we're gone, which is something else I think about, which is quite a haunting concept. We'll all be digital ghosts eventually, right? So it's I'd like to write more about it. I wish I was more technologically versed. It helps that my husband is a kind of did physics at university and is an engineer and does a lot of high-tech stuff now, because he sometimes explains things to me in layman's terms in a way that I can access. I imagine that there are going to be some people who are well versed in VR who read the book and go, nope, that's wrong. In which case I apologize deeply in advance. But I don't think it interferes with the conceptual part of the novel, which is what would happen if a woman was hooked up to a program which allowed her to take control of her own therapeutic experience by navigating a series of virtual environments. And then what would happen if perhaps somehow beyond that, her brain kind of meshed with the program in a way that nobody anticipated, and she could start to live out her full potential using technology as a tool. So yeah, that's very much a nod towards Black Mirror. And also, again, people like Jeff Noon, he write that kind of technological sci-fi that I loved. And another major influence is Stephen Hall's The Rorschach texts, which is a very allegorical portrayal of one man's grief. That's much, much more wildly conceptual than mine, which is rooted in technology. But the kind of concept still stands. In his novel, there is a conceptual word shark hunting him across the pages of the novel. And that's actually a manifestation of his grief and anger at losing his girlfriend on holiday in Greece. And I wanted something similar, so it's not a new concept, but I wove something into my novel and along the same lines. So I'm very interested in fiction that blurs the boundaries of reality and plays with the concept of reality, but then also how you can maybe kind of squoosh that into a technological question as well, so there's just enough reality to make you question the reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and talking about a digital imprint that will kind of last after our death. I mean, it kind of made me realize, me and Bob have done now nearly over 500 episodes of this. It will be very easy for people to take all the audio, kind of create an AI of us, and then once we're dead, they can continue interviewing people. They could just feed the book into the AI.
Another thing that fascinates me is the idea of, you know, how you have a forensic archaeologist who will piece together the parts of a body long deceased to try and give it an identity. And often they do that so that the relatives of somebody who is missing has some sort of bodily remains which to cremate or have a funeral around, or, you know, it's that identification process is key to the whole point of forensic archaeology in many ways. What am I saying? Is it forensic archaeology or anthropology? I beg your pardon, forensic anthropology. But then imagine you take that forward in a world where there are digital forensic anthropologists or archaeologists, and they're piecing together the pieces of you that existed 200-300 years prior, and they're rebuilding your identity for the purposes of history or science or whatever, right? That fascinates me. And then we've got the concept of consent. Like, do we consent to that happening? Like, you know how Professor von Hagen had bodies on display in his exhibition that dealt with the kind of human body. It was plastinated human bodies that were all completely exposed and on display. And people paid money and they walked around and they saw it. Those people had donated their bodies to him for that purpose. So they had consented. But where's the online version of that? You know, is there going to be a holographic reproduction of Michael in 40 years' time, you know, talking about horror? And where is the consent inherent in that? Again, that's quite a horrible concept, right? But it can also be quite a comforting one, because your ancestors will go, oh, that's Uncle Michael. And Isn't it bizarre? Isn't it bizarre how we just don't know? We don't know. There could be an enormous technological blackout in the next 20 years, and all of this is dead, and none of this will carry on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's you just don't know, and that's fascinating to me. Absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I think in terms of consent, I mean, if we think about the amount of times that we click things and we accept the terms and conditions digitally,
Yeah.
and we
I know.
don't
Get rid of those cookies, motherfucker.
Yeah, well,
It's no, I do not consent.
we get rid of the cookies, but they'll often be like, if you
Sure.
want an Apple program, it's like click to agree to the terms of and conditions, and it's like, I don't agree, and it's like, okay, you can't have the program. And then like some kind of sulky teenager, okay, fine,
Yeah.
I agree, reluctantly, begrudgingly. But
Yeah.
there's probably something, either where I've uploaded this or even where I'm hosting it, where I've consented to something, where then in years to come, the big corporation that then owns some of that can then consent for all of the podcasters on their platform to be turned into these bizarre AI versions. And I mean that in terms of creating things, I know, goodness, I think it was a few years ago now when Joanna Penn was talking about, the idea of there being technology where you can upload some stories from the authors and then they will come up with a kind of digital version of a story that they might have written, and there's no real question attached to that. It's a weird idea, and it's a weird idea too that there's the potential, as the technology gets advanced enough, that there may be AI created stories that are better than some non-AI created stories.
Well, of course.
there's
there's Midjourney, right? There's Midjourney art, which everyone's playing with at the moment, which terrifies me. This kind of AI art, and you put in a sequence of key search terms, and it gives you this digital painting, which often is extremely appealing to look at. It's scary to me in one sense, but in another sense, I think I was talking scared about this. There's the concept of, with animation and stuff, with uncanny valley, right? Where you as a human intrinsically know that what you're looking at isn't human, even though it looks like you, talks like you, moves like you. It's still not quite good enough to mimic you completely to the point where you know it's human. So I think there's a part of us that will continue to seek out human created content because we just know deep down, even, because it's flawed, that it was created by somebody else like us. But like, it is fascinating to me to see how that will evolve going forward. It's fascinating. It's the idea of automation and the ethics, I suppose, surrounding it as well.
Yeah. And I don't think, at least if I think about what I personally enjoy and why I enjoy different stories, that AI created fiction would ever replace human created fiction for me, in a sense that it would make it obsolete. Now, I certainly think there's the potential that there could be AI created fiction that I enjoy. That doesn't seem inconceivable. But one of the reasons that, I like a lot of human created fiction is that it's real, authentic stories, and there's a story behind the story. And
right.
so
this is the whole point of the novel that I've written, is about me. It'd be very difficult for a computer generated program to have been through the same experiences and written the same thing, unless you get to the point where the program doesn't realize it's a program and it has kind of falsely imprinted memories of something which it experiences emotional reactions to, and then goes on to put those into the fiction. But we're we're off in the realm of sci-fi.
Let's assume that it does. But even if that were the case, I feel, because we know that is in fact AI, so it didn't really experience it, then that has removed a layer of authenticity, because it isn't authentic.
But the computer thinks it is, so the pain is authentic, isn't? And these are the things that I like to play with in my head. The kind of what ifs. It's the whole I guess, love, death, robots thing, right? Can machines feel? Can robots feel? Again, Asimov played with that a lot. It's the idea of self-awareness and consciousness, and many people kind of liken the human brain to a computer anyway. It works in similar ways, right? And we don't even understand a tenth of the own potential of our own brains. So it doesn't make sense to me that there is a future in which the possibility of kind of sentient AI doesn't perhaps rear its head in the future. I don't know enough about it scientifically, but it just, if what we're doing with computing is replicating the human brain, then I don't see why that doesn't also include emotions and feelings and thoughts. That kind of, does that make, I love exploring that and thinking about that. It's it adds another layer to the idea of humanity, I think, that is worth giving our brains a bit of time to.
If I create an AI that can feel pain, and the AI feels pain, did it really feel pain?
But the ethics of that don't all mean it almost doesn't matter, because the thing is in pain.
Mm-hmm. But
right?
I want to know the answer to this question.
But pain is,
I'm being unethical.
So pain is there's a very prescient thing for full immersion. So in the novel, one of the experimental program managers talks about a real world experiment which I researched, a VR experiment where the participants were exposed to chili powder, right? And some of them were just sat in a room, and they either had it rubbed on their skin or they ingested it, can't remember which. And the other ones were in a virtual reality setting surrounded by polar ice caps and the Arctic. The ones that were in that VR setting with the headset on, with the immersion and all that going on around them, experienced less physical pain than the ones that weren't, because they were being immersed in a cold, icy situation, and the capsicum element of the chili powder wasn't as effective to them as it was without that distraction. So how much of what we experience in pain is physical, and how much of that is the brain, and how much of that is mental? And if that is the case, then a computer could, in theory, experience a real level of pain if a lot of it is to do with brainwaves and how you process pain and pain receptors and things like that. I don't know. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a neurologist. But to me, it's fascinating that you can affect your body physically by convincing your brain that you are somewhere other than where you are. And I think that's how hypnosis works to a certain level. You see examples of this with people around the world who walk across beds of coals or nails, lie on beds of nails, and they don't experience any pain. They've convinced themselves there is no pain. There is, I think, a level of consciousness that we don't know on an everyday basis how to access, which allows us to override the physical symptoms of pain, maybe. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm just going on what I've observed, right? Or they have an extremely high pain tolerance. Maybe they're just biologically weird. I don't know. But I do think that all of that is still vastly unexplored. So why wouldn't you be able to replicate that in a computer program? Who knows? Like, what is pain? What is the actual definition of pain? That's a big old broad question.
Yeah. So you just thrown me down a rabbit hole where I just want to explore all these philosophical questions now, and of course, we're not going to, on This Is Horror podcast, come up. But with also, I'm not a
scientist at all, so I'm literally just spitballing fucking theories with no scientific basis.
This, like the best This Is Horror podcast, in my opinion, this is now kind of just turned into going down the pub and talking about these weird kind of philosophical ideas. And so now I'm wondering, so do we think, and by we I mean Bob and Gemma, that it is as unethical to hurt a computer as it is a human? Is that the conclusion that we're going down? That if the pain is as real for the computer as it is for the human, then it is as unethical, because my gut reaction is that it's more unethical to hurt the human. But I'm interested in exploring this, so I want your takes. I also want the listeners' takes. So tweet us at This Is Horror if you can get this answer in like less than the character limit. So,
Jesus,
you know,
yes, I look forward to that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I on a really basic level, I can't speak for Bob, but I just don't like the idea of hurting anyone, really.
Mm-hmm.
Like plants, people, computers, animals. You know, I know I can't categorize them all in the same level, and I shouldn't. But just the very concept of causing pain or harm to anything or anybody really just upsets me.
What about in a video game?
I'm going to err on the side of caution and say I don't like it. Even in video games, I'm pathetic at video games. I just can't. I like puzzle games. Give me an empty fantasy world to explore and solve puzzles in, like Myst or Cyan Worlds or any of that stuff, and I'm happy. As soon as you introduce an element of threat or personal interaction, or like why people play The Last of Us, which is like the most emotionally devastating thing.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine like being in that driving seat and having to make decisions that affect fictional characters in that way. I can't do it personally because I'm a big old wuss. I remember talking to someone about like, we got an Xbox finally for my kid, and I've played a few games. I'm not really into gaming that much, but I want to learn more about it. And I thought I'll start off easy, and I went with Resident Evil 7. And I got so scared I couldn't actually remember how to control my character.
God, that's the scariest Resident Evil of the entire series.
It was awful, and I had to get my husband to come downstairs to take the controller off me to fgira out how to run away because I had a complete shutdown. So I'm a terrible person to ask in that sense, because I just don't like the idea of hurting anybody, really. Like, I never have. I've always, even cartoons, if I saw a sad cartoon character, I'd be devastated. I'm a very emotional person, which anybody who knows me will understand. So, can't speak for Bob, though. Bob has probably different opinions.
Well, I mean, I don't like hurting people, but, you know, if it comes down to, you know, I think that let's say that you get angry about something and it's your computer compared to getting angry with a person. Okay, the person you can talk to and things like that. I think ultimately, if you got angry at your computer and you got physical, then in a sense, you've actually hurt yourself, because you're probably going to need a computer, and punching your fist through the monitor isn't really going to help you. It's going to hurt you physically, and it's going to hurt you, monetarily, because you're going to have to buy a new monitor. You know? But sometimes that shit feels really fucking good. So,
you sound like a man who's punched his fist.
I was going to say, do we need to leave Bob alone for a minute? Be right back, just off to smash some liquid crystals.
Yeah.
No, because I mean, I work in tech, and I have to interface, and we use iPads, which are really, really strong. The software that we use sucks because the corporation, we got it for free. It was one of the shareholders. Well, it doesn't work, but it was free. It's like, at that point right there, do you want to punch the computer or punch the person who made that decision? And I mean, realistically, what we should do is punch the person who made that decision.
There's a lot of punching going on there.
I think I've accidentally caused pain to Bob. We've opened up.
There's a latent nerve here that's just been tickled. There's a punch nerve.
I think that people, including myself, should be punched more often. Then we learn better.
Jesus.
And I have to throw myself in there because I can be a jerk.
Endorse this message.
But I mean, we're talking about physical pain or emotional pain on computers. At the end of the day, you may feel ethically that they do feel something, because, like, say, you're talking about the AI, and it can be taught to or it can learn to do this and become sentient and things like that. But at the end of the day, you're just a fucking machine.
But then our definition of a machine as well. The other thing I tend to think of a lot now, which I spend far too much brain power on, is the idea of fungi and fungal neural networks, which is a fantastically interesting thing. I don't know if you've seen Fantastic Fungi documentary on Netflix, and other fiction goes into this an awful lot. But there's kind of quite strong evidence that mushrooms and other fungi kind of have a network. And that's how they communicate, right? I don't know exactly how it works, but how is that any different to how a computer network works? It isn't. It really isn't. So what is your definition of a machine? Is it something that's utterly inorganic? And in that case, it makes it acceptable. Is it a question of how it works? How do we define machine capability? I don't know. These are all like... I wish I was cleverer sometimes so that I could actually genuinely dig into these things and read around them and understand them. But I know that as soon as I started Googling, that I would drown in academic papers that I didn't have the beginnings of being able to understand. So, but I feel like the world is built on a series of organic networks, maybe that are operate not unlike a computer. Maybe, I don't know. Feel free to correct me, because I'm very much out of my depth now. I really am.
I think that after this conversation, we're all going to go away researching so much in terms of all these kind of philosophical and moral questions that we've now raised. And
I'm not. I'm going to go and brush the crumbs out of my minge.
Okay, well, that's classic. Classic Gemma.
When you start asking these questions and you start trying to get the answers to these questions, what the universe does at that point is it poses more questions. So, in other words, if you take it out to the next logical conclusion, just like if you started on something, you could theoretically 10 years later going, and then this needs to be answered, and you haven't gained any ground.
But this is what science fiction is. This is what science fiction is utterly rooted in, is questioning. Right. Questioning our current reality and then posing a future in which a reality is different in a way that answers those questions. And I think that's why I've always been drawn to it, because how much science fiction do we now see as an actuality? Right. And that's, I love that. That's the potential of the human brain right there, questioning our own existence and then changing it constantly as we drive forward and we learn more about ourselves and we learn new about new technologies and stuff. So it's we're always evolving, I think. And I love that. And a lot of that plays out in science fiction, which is something I'd like to explore a lot more of going forward. I'd like to write more sci-fi, actually. And it's a different kettle of fish to writing a horror novel, but it kind of is and isn't. But it's very easy to fall foul of critics with sci-fi because science fiction has to be grounded in science, unfortunately. Yeah. So,
Yeah. Well, we've got a question from Nicole Neely via Patreon, and she would like to know, what is the best advice that you have for other mums or parents in general who write horror?
Advice in terms of, I guess, how to do it or how to juggle the two? I don't know.
Nicole has literally just said advice. So any advice you can, it's a kind of choose your own adventure, I suppose.
I guess so. I think if we're talking in terms of juggling and wanting to be somebody who writes and also parents, I get that. I get the struggle between finding time for yourself. I mean, for me personally, I've always wanted to be a writer and I've always written and I've had various attempts over my life to kind of finish novels and stuff. But when you have a career or other responsibilities, it's very, very difficult to finish anything creatively. It just is. Because you need consistency and you need routine in order to kind of fully get yourself in the headspace to tell a story properly, I think, personally. So, hats off to anybody with a full-time job who's doing this gig and they're making it work, because I have nothing but respect for that because I couldn't do it. But for me, I wasn't really able to focus on writing creatively until my kids started school. So that's the thing that I would say is it's absolutely fine and valid to struggle because kids don't leave a lot of energy for you at the end of the day. Mine certainly didn't and still doesn't. If we're talking in terms of the themes, I wonder whether there is an extra layer of horror awareness that you get when you have kids that perhaps you didn't have an appreciation of before. And I've spoken about this in other areas, but like particularly in terms of body horror, in terms of what suddenly scares you that didn't scare you before. Like your entire relationship with fear completely transforms when you have children, or it certainly did with me. I'm fucking terrified of everything now when my kid's involved that I wouldn't have been before. Your role as a caregiver and a protector gives you a heightened sense of awareness and threat and fear that never goes away, which is quite exhausting. It's something they don't tell you about being a parent, but they don't tell you a lot about being a parent. In a way, though, it kind of sets you up almost to be a horror writer, because you suddenly get a full understanding of what fear feels like, right? I'm not dismissing the different types of fear and other people's kind of relationships and experiences with it. I'm not saying you can't be scared if you don't have kids. I don't mean that at all. It's more that for me personally, my personal boundaries and relationships with those stronger emotions and fears and threats and stuff completely transformed when I had a child. Obviously, I struggled with my own mental health as well postnatally, and that's something that I explore a lot in my own work. In some ways, being a horror writer and the horror genre is a great opportunity to explore some of those more difficult themes and thoughts and fears in a way that makes sense to then go on and read. Because you can have a monster which symbolizes something. You can have something under the bed which represents your fear. You can talk about those kind of things in a way that perhaps in other genres you might not be able to quite so easily. I'm not sure I'm giving you any advice, rather than just kind of giving you my thoughts and feelings about being a horror writer and a parent, but I often find that they feed into each other quite a lot. If that helps, I hope that helps.
Right, yeah. I think there's a lot to kind of process and think about with that. And I mean, like, it's just difficult being a parent and writing, and you almost write in spite of the obstacles, I find. And like you said, you are a writer. You've always wanted to be a writer. I find whatever happens, we will find a way. And it might not be ideal, but we'll do what we can, and we have to try our very best not to beat ourselves up for what we can't do, even if
this is it.
It is in our nature.
Kids have no agenda. Like, you never know what you're going to get on any given day with having a child and being a parent. Like, you literally can't plan or prepare for anything, because they might get sick, or they might fall off the bed and break their arm, or there's something might happen, or you'll have to drop them at practice, or there's a billion and one different extra variables that come into your life when you're a parent. That you didn't have to perhaps worry about before. I suppose it's the same if you have animals as well. I hear that a lot. If you have a pet, suddenly, oh my God, your life is no longer your own. And that plays into how much free time you have and how much ability you'd have to develop a routine that's good for you as well as for your children. And what I would say is that it's extremely important as a parent to carve that time out for yourself, if at all possible. It's not always possible for everybody, particularly if you're a working parent as well, or if you're a single parent family, or for whatever reason. It isn't easy to find time for yourself, but it is very important if you can, because you lose a sense of your own identity massively when you have children. I remember the analogy I always used was, it was like when my kid was born, it felt like I put myself in a box and put myself on a shelf for 2 or 3 years until I had time to open the box again, because you're in survival mode. I was feeding and changing nappies and trying to sleep and, making sure the child survives and eats properly and develops into a nice rounded human being. It doesn't leave much time for you at the end of all of that. There's very little left for you. And it's very easy to lose grip on your own identity. until they get a little bit older and a bit more self-sufficient. And that's how it should be. I guess that's parenting. You're there for them first and foremost. They are your priority. But that doesn't always have to be the case going forward as they get a bit older and a bit more self-sufficient. You are a better parent, I find, and a better writer if you take time for yourself to do the things that you love, the things that make you feel like you. And again, like everything else in this conversation, it's about balance and finding that balance. And that can be tricky. And there are no manuals for that. Nobody tells you how to do that shit. You just figure it out as you go along clumsily, like most things.
Yeah. Well, what is it that you're currently working on?
Ooh, right. So let's have a look at my whiteboard. I have currently got a novel with my agent, which hopefully will go out for submission fairly soon, which I'm excited about, which I'm tweaking and editing and polishing just to make it as punchy and impactful as it can be. That one's kind of a tribute to Daphne du Maurier, I'm in a du Maurier kick at the moment, rediscovering a lot of her fiction. And I wanted to write something that was very grounded in reality for a change, because the novels that I've written lately have been either about parallel universes or experimental science or ghosts. And I wanted to write something that was actually grounded in reality again and in the same mold as Dear Laura. So that I'm just polishing and tweaking. I am working on something I'm not sure if I can talk about. I think I can, for Creepy Podcast at the moment, an idea that I'm sort of developing with them. I am doing a lot of kind of PR and stuff to push the launch of Full Immersion, which is something else they don't prepare you for as well. When you get a book that's traditionally published and you do have the opportunity to work with a PR person, you're going to need to set aside some significant time to help you promote that book as well. And by that, it means writing guest blog articles and doing the interviews and putting in the work. That's not something that you necessarily understand before you get to that point. You're like, oh shit, there's a whole new chunk of work I need to do to make sure this book gets seen and heard about. I have got to start recording the audio for season 2 of Calling Darkness, which has been totally written by S.H. Cooper for this season. I'm still in it. So that will be out at some point in the future, which will be fun. What else? I am reissuing Cruel Works of Nature, my short story collection, in hardback as a hardback edition with a couple of extra stories thrown in for good measure, which I'm quite excited about. So I'm just polishing off those last 2 stories. And I am also working on an idea for a crime novel that I hope to write with my good friend V. Castro, who seems to be quite on board and quite excited about that idea. So we'll see what happens about that. That's a crime novel, which is kind of travel crime that feeds into my love of travel and exotic locations and stuff as well. And I've probably got about 3 more novels that I might try and work on next year. And I'm also deep in the middle of kind of finishing the treatment for Dear Laura that I've been working on with a couple of industry folks who've been guiding me through the process of what it's like to write a movie treatment. Like anything with Hollywood, who knows where that'll end up, if it'll even go anywhere. But it's been a fantastic learning curve. And I'm hoping to do some more stuff in film next year as much as humanly possible as well. I was just working with creatives locally and making some short films and just exploring that, because I've always wanted to be more involved in the movies, and since I was a kid I've been fascinated. So that's something else that I'll also hopefully be getting my teeth into. And then beyond that, I'm doing some book cover commissions. There's other stuff that I've forgotten without checking my list, but I'm busy as I like to be. So yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned Dear Laura a couple of times, and I mean, last time we spoke, we were excited because it was going to be adapted for No Sleep podcast.
Oh,
and
it was, yeah.
And
of course,
that has now happened,
yes.
And it's so good. It's so
Thank
good.
you. I really enjoyed. actually adapting it for audio helped me a lot to think about adapting it for screen as well. Although the two are very different, the book in itself is actually quite a difficult one to adapt because it jumps around from time to time. There are various different versions of Laura as she ages over a long period of time, which is quite difficult to represent visually and in audio. It's minimal locations, minimal cast of characters. So there's a lot of different considerations with audio, with exposition, with a filmic version of it, in like having a strong narrative thread that ties the different versions of Laura together in a way that a viewer would understand and like instinctively know that was her. It's a difficult one to adapt. The story seems very simple, or it did when I wrote it, but the more you try and visualize it in a different medium, the more you realize, fucking hell, I wish I'd done a single time, or like, you know, I wish I'd done this slightly differently. But that's the challenge, and that's the beauty of being able to do it yourself, because you understand the story better than anyone else, right? You should do as the writer. So the fact that I've been given the opportunity to explore that, regardless of whether it goes anywhere, is wonderful. And people seem to really like the audio adaptation. Not everybody, but that's fair, because that's no sleep in that world. And I learned a lot by doing it. And I thought the end result was just very good, very classy, beautifully acted, beautifully narrated. The music for that was, I think, some of the best that Brandon had written up to that point. And I was just so involved in the whole process. I felt very privileged to be able to have that much involvement in it. Yeah, and it's also a great thing to sort of send out to people as a bit of a proof of concept as well, in a way, because the audio adaptation is a bit like an ear movie, I always say.
Yeah.
It felt quite cinematic to me, yeah.
Yeah. Will No Sleep, or will you release it as kind of one piece? I mean, in the sense that, like, when it was released, you've got like 20 minutes on each episode. Is it
Sure.
something which, you know, you could put on Audible or something? I don't know how the kind of rights work or what the plans
I don't think
are.
it would end up on Audible, because there is an audio book version of it with Tantor Media that's on Audible. And because No Sleep kind of have their own way of doing things, but I do think we've sort of toyed with the idea of re-releasing it in one go, or one bundle or something, some that people can sort of buy and download in one chunk. But I haven't actually asked anybody that. I'll ask David, and it's a good question, because there's definitely been bandied around before, the idea of doing it as a complete unit. But yeah, for now, it's just, I think the easiest way of accessing all of that is to just type my name into the search bar in the No Sleep podcast website.
Yeah.
And it'll kind of should come up with all the episoes.
Yeah, I can confirm that it does. I just wondered, like, if there were future
it's a good question. It's a good question. I will drop David a note and ask him what the plans are. A lot of that is kind of down to the technological capabilities of the platform and stuff as well, and how they can bundle things. I think they're with Glow as a hoster, so how it gets bundled, I don't know.
Yeah, and I suppose if you did, it's always about thinking, well, how can we sell this? What's the kind of appeal? And so I wonder, I mean, would it be like throwing a kind of author's note in, or, I mean, another, because you've had so many stories over the years on No Sleep, I mean, is there scope for them releasing a kind of special Gemma Amor the No Sleep podcast collection?
Oh God, no, I wouldn't like that. I think it's interesting because there are so many other authors on that show who've had like 5 times the amount of stories produced than I have, just because they've been with the show a lot longer. And also there's so many new authors constantly writing brilliant stuff. I'd feel a bit uncomfortable with anything like that. Like, I think it's a show where by nature there's something new every week. And I think actually some listeners get a bit annoyed when you focus on one writer too much anyway. There's a lot of eye rolling that goes on in that sense if you get too much airtime. So,
I mean, I wasn't suggesting it as like an episode of No Sleep, but maybe like a kind of offshoot. I'm just giving David more work, basically. I think what I'm accidentally saying is, why doesn't No Sleep start their own audiobook line? It's like,
well, they have got a publishing arm that they're starting off, so they're starting to publish fiction. I don't know quite what's happening with that. I think S.H. Cooper probably knows more about that than I do, because I think she's had a book out with them. But I imagine it's definitely something they probably want to consider in the future. Who knows? They're a busy bunch. They've got a very tight schedule. They have a huge amount of content that they create on a weekly basis. So I think it's up to how much capability they have as well in terms of kind of manpower and stuff. But maybe one day, who knows?
I'm just trying to give everyone more work and make people more money with very obvious ideas. So if anyone wants to consult me for some more obvious ideas, then that is a service that I can offer.
Sounds like a good deal to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. Basically,
thank you for having me back.
Yeah, it has been a pleasure. And I really hope that Full Immersion does incredibly well. You deserve the success, and this book deserves
I really am already kind of. It's so interesting to me to start getting news coverage for a book, because previously it's just been, okay, I've built up my reader circle, for whom I'm endlessly grateful. Here's my new book, off you go and read it. And if I'm lucky, it'll get covered in some blog posts, or I'll go onto a podcast and chat about it. But with this one, I think because there's a PR team involved, or perhaps just because of where I am in my career now, I'm slightly better known. I'm being featured in Publishers Weekly and in Library Journal and on Gizmodo and Love Reading and all these websites that it boggles my mind that I'm getting coverage, and it's actually a very emotional experience for me to see my books featured in these publications, because up until now I've had to do everything myself, and now suddenly my book's got a Library Journal review, and I don't know how to feel about that. I'm so grateful, and also just like, I don't know, it's on the one hand it shouldn't matter, but on the other hand it does, because those kind of industry publications continue to help raise awareness of who you are as a writer, and they push you forward in people's consciousness. And I've got a network of readers that I know will engage with my stuff, but perhaps there are more readers out there that I can reach in different ways. And it's in the same way that people sort of scoff at awards and go, oh, well, you don't need an award to be a good writer. And it's absolutely true. You don't need that. And it's not really about validation. But what the Stoker nomination did for me was it opened up a whole new world and tier of opportunities that I might not have had without the Stoker nom, which then helped me in my career, and it helps me to do this for a living. So these things are important to me. They do matter. And the fact that it's sort of finally happening, I see other writers who are having a similar experience at the moment. Gabino Iglesias has just had a feature in the New York Times. I mean, how surreal that must be, doing the grift for like 14, 15 years, and then suddenly a journalist flies out and interviews you for the New York Times, right? That's an incredible moment of validation. It doesn't necessarily affect the performance of a book. I don't know. I don't know enough about traditional publishing yet to know whether my book will even do that well. But simply seeing industry publications review it and give it favourable reviews too it's been a hugely emotional experience for me. And it's something I wasn't prepared for as well emotionally either. I think I assumed it because I've done this a few times. I knew it all, and I really don't. I'm reminded of that on a daily basis. So, yeah, I hope it does perform well in the traditional sense of shifting copies too. Obviously, I would love it to reach a second printing. I would love for Angry Robot's belief in me to be rewarded in that sense. But on a deeply personal level as well, I just want it to be, I guess, critically well received, because not because I need that ego boost, but because this is a story about me, and it's a story about something that I think is important. And I want that to be received in the spirit in which I wrote it and in the way it was intended to be received. So, yeah. Yeah, it's a journey.
Yeah. Well, we wish you the best of luck, and we hope that you'll have someone from the New York Times flying over to interview you soon too.
It's a long old way to Bristol.
Yeah. I don't know. You can take them on a haunted tour of England. We were talking about haunted places last time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, man.
that's something
I'd
to
love
share
that.
with them. All right. Well, where can our listeners connect with you?
So I would say number one place to visit at the moment is the Angry Robot website to look at the full immersion page where you can find various different ways of ordering the book. And also you should now, which is the first time I've ever been able to say this, walk into any good bookstore and find a copy of Full Immersion when it releases on the 13th on the shelves. And if not, please do ask the bookseller or the bookstore to order it in, which they should be able to now do universally. It helps as well. It all helps. Beyond that, you can find me on Twitter with the handle Many Little Words, and the same on Instagram. I'm messing about with TikTok, but I'm very bad at it. And I'm on Facebook too. I think I can't remember what I am, just stick my name in. And you can find my podcasting credits and audio stuff on Podchaser. Stick my name into Google and I'm pretty much there in many different iterations. There's a digital imprint of me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
I would say my main thought at this point is just to, because I'm in that headspace at the moment, I very much want to impart a message of thanks to everybody that's sort of been with me on this journey thus far. And that includes the podcasters who've taken an interest in me and have taken the time to interview me and research me and ask me insightful questions. It's the readers. It's the people who have gone out of their way to review the book and give it an honest review, whether or not they liked it. It's the other writers and other authors that have been generous and brilliant with their time and their feedback. People like Laurel Hightower, people like Glenn Mazzara, people like Brandon Boone, David Cummings, all of those people in my life who have supported me thus far. I am just endlessly grateful for that. And I hope I can repay some of that as well going forward a little bit. I am excited to see where things go. I'm also excited that I get to meet so many of you in the industry in person at different events and stuff. So I think my main parting thought is one of immense gratitude and thanks to everybody who's kind of helped me. I sound like I'm giving a fucking Oscar speech, but everyone that's helped me to get to this point now where I have a book coming out with a traditional publisher. That means the world to me, because I had no idea any of this was going to happen back when I started tinkering around with fiction again in 2018. So yeah, you're all fucking brilliant, really. So cheers.
Thank you so much for listening to This Is Horror with Gemma Amor. Join us again next time when we will be chatting with Tyler Jones. But if you would like to get that ahead of the crowd, if you would like to get every episode ahead of the crowd, then become our patron at patreon.com/thisishorror. Not only do you get early bird access to each and every episode, but you get to submit questions to the interviewee. And coming up very shortly, we will be chatting with Brian Asman and Jonathan Jans. And supporting the This Is Horror podcast is the best way to keep the show alive. It is also a way to help me out personally, as I have been saying for a number of months now. I am going through quite a difficult time. The worst time, in fact. So any support on Patreon would be a tremendous help. You're also going to get exclusive podcasts, Story Unbox, the horror podcast on the craft of writing, and the Q&A sessions with myself and Bob Pastorella. And you can also become a part of the Writers Forum over on Discord. We are always doing writing challenges. It is a great place to up your writing game and to be challenged and encouraged by like-minded people. So check it out, patreon.com/thisishorror, and see if it's a good fit for you. Okay, before I wrap up, a little bit of an advert break.
Horror on Main, a new weekend convention for the horror community. Exploring all the shadows of horror, our guests include writers and actors, but also artists, publishers, directors, composers, and more. We've been going to cons for over 20 years and are changing up the little things to make the big picture amazing. Beyond guests, contests, movies, panels, and podcasters, our layout and programming are designed to further incorporate the very idea of community. Join us Memorial Day weekend 2023 in Hunt Valley, Maryland. Come to the block party and meet your new neighbors. HorrorOnMain.com. Tried and true or done to death. It was all a dream. An anthology of bad horror tropes done right revives even the most exhausted cliches with stories from some of horror's biggest names like Gemma Files, Gabino Iglesias, and Haley Piper. It was all a dream. An anthology of bad horror tropes done right. Available October 18th anywhere you buy books online. Pre-order now. Use this code ThisIsHorror for 20% off through the month of October when you order direct from HungryShadowPress.com.
As always, I would like to end with a quote, and this is from Wes Craven. Horror films don't create fear, they release it. I'll see you in the next episode with Tyler Jones, but until then, take care of yourselves, be good to one another, read horror, keep on writing, and have a great, great day.
This is Horror Podcast.